Yes.
Yes. All right. Okay. Welcome, everyone. I think maybe we're here today to talk about student-centered strategies for first-year language instruction. I am Dr. Ellen Lee. I am a teaching associate now, professor
Woo!
promoted
Promotion.
at the University of Pittsburgh. And I'm here with Dr. Amy Pistone from Gonzaga University, and I said it right this time.
You did. I'm so proud of you.
Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit?
Sure. I am Amy Pistone at the pronouncing it right part is people get very fussy. It's not Gonzaga, it's Gonzaga. It's a nice Midwestern A there. I am in 3 days. I am technically my tenure officially starts in 3 days. And I don't know, I do Greek stuff and I love working with Ellen on pedagogy stuff for the Women's Classical Caucus.
Yeah. That is why we are here today is Women's Classical Caucus Pedagogy series that Amy and I have been working on for the past few years. I do want to throw out there. Wait, there we go. Speaking of Women's Classical Caucus, there is a pop-up workshop happening tomorrow on writing and revising abstracts. Um, uh, One of the things to consider is that Feminism and Classics, the Feminism and Classics Conference, uh, abstract deadline will be coming up in mid-early September. So something to keep in mind as we're heading into the semester. Um, the let's see. Were there any other announcements or anything that you wanted to flag, Amy?
Nope, don't think so. I will,
Okay.
if anything comes to mind, I will throw it in the chat as other important links. I'm about to drop the Feminism and Classics link as well. If
Awesome.
folks have not gone to Feminism and Classics before, highly recommend. It's one of probably the best conference, and it only comes around every 3-ish years. So don't miss. Oh no, Suzanne beat me to it. Don't miss that opportunity. It has been described to it was first described to me as like the SCS, but only the people you're excited to see are there. And
Yeah,
so
that is pretty much exactly how I sold it the other day. Um it's like the chill version where all the cool kids go of like a big version of a big conference, right? Highly recommended. And Also this workshop to help you think about how to write your abstract to get there. All right, so let's talk a little bit about what we're going to do today. Like I said, the goal today is to talk about student-centered approaches to first-year language instruction. So first, we're going to talk about some of our challenges in first-year language. We're going to talk a little bit about defining student-centered approaches. Uh-oh, how did I do that? I don't know. Um, Defining student-centered learning, and then talk about how student-centered learning can actually help in our first-year language classes. We'll run through a few examples that Amy and I have developed for our own classes, talk a little bit about some caveats, and then most of our time is going to be spent on workshopping and discussion. So let's go ahead and get started, I think. With WCC workshops, we always start with these essential agreements. I'll just read through these. So for the duration of this session, we will be fully present and fully participatory. We will take responsibility for our own assumptions and about each other's intent. We will hold ourselves accountable to do the work of sharing experiences and coming to new understandings. We will be comfortable being in discomfort, and we will refrain from language or behavior that's threatening, harassing, or attacking on another participant. All right. So keep those things in mind as we move forward. So let's dig into the meat of it. What is our challenge right now? And there's a lot of them. Um, Teaching ancient languages, well, teaching languages generally, but also teaching ancient languages maybe specifically, is really hard right now. And there's a bunch of reasons for that. There's all the reasons that existed, 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago, when we learned languages for the first time, however long ago that was. But also, uh, there's additional things now, right? So digital tools like Google Translate and ChatGPT allow students to shortcut their learning and kind of get correct answers without knowing how they got to those answers. Um, for folks who are interested in talking more about AI stuff, Amy led that workshop last week. If you want to chat a bit about more about some of the things that came up there, we can circle back around to that when we get to the workshop and discussion. Um, so we've got those kinds of things, and they're being used more and more by overburdened students who are really lacking time for intensive language study. This happens for a whole lot of reasons. In higher ed, there's students who are taking just way too many classes and not being stopped by administrators from doing so. Uh, um, at the secondary level, we have students who are kind of doing the same, taking on so much stuff. Um, uh, and one of the problems that they're in is kind of complicated by the fact that educational institutions are increasingly hostile to kind of these slow processes of language learning. Um, they want students to do all of this stuff, and they're not considering kind of the time that it takes, right? That what students need to actively do in order to uh, learn languages effectively, right? So how do we teach beginning level languages in this environment? Um, there are lots of ways that this can be done, and the thing that I particularly want to focus our thoughts on today is student-centered learning and teaching. Um, so this is not the only way to teach languages. This is not the only kind of counter approach that we can have to respond to these challenges. Um, but I think it's an important one, and I think it's the one that has been the most productive for me so far. So, student-centered learning and teaching can has a whole it's kind of hard to define. So there's a lot of terms that get thrown around in here. Student-centered learning and teaching, like I already said, SCLT is how it's abbreviated sometimes in research literature. It's also referred to sometimes as learner or person or child-centered, especially if we're talking about not higher ed, but primary and secondary education. Um, and it's often set as opposed to, right, teacher-centered instruction or this model of sage on the stage, right, or teaching as telling, or otherwise just referred to as traditional educational models. But often it's not super well defined. And one of the things that I've noticed kind of looking at the scholarship, especially in around teaching of ancient languages, right? When this term gets used, that's it's not always kind of uh clear exactly what it means or what people kind of if people are referring to kind of a specific model of student-centered teaching or if they're kind of referring to like general vibes. And actually in a lot of ways, I think I actually kind of like referring to it with general vibes. As maybe we'll see in a minute, I think it actually can kind of be useful to think about it that way because coming up with a definition is really hard. So to come up with a definition, I was doing some research around this just to see how different people define it, and came across the fact that there is, of course, because academics, a Rutledge handbook on this. Because of course there is. Why wouldn't there be? Um, which it turns out I actually really like. There's some really interesting stuff in here, including some stuff I'm gonna assign in the graduate pedagogy course that I'll be teaching for the first time this semester. I'm very excited about it. It's gonna be so fun. But there's some really interesting stuff in here. But they also, despite the fact that there's like 70 scholars contributing to this volume, have kind of a tough time defining student-centered learning and teaching in kind of a specific way. So this is the definition that the editors give in the introduction. We define SCLT, that is student-centered learning and teaching, as an umbrella term of a variety of pedagogical concepts, approaches, and techniques, wherein students and their learning are placed at the heart of the educational process with the aim to foster deeper learning processes and outcomes for students to become self-directed, lifelong learners. That's kind of vague, right? Like, it's a lot of different things that can do this teaching thing in a lot of ways. They do go on to define what they mean by deeper learning. So, deeper learning occurs when the learner strives to make sense of the to be learned material by selecting relevant information, organizing it into a coherent structure, and integrating it with prior knowledge. So, they're giving us a little bit more of what they mean by deep learning. But they're not necessarily kind of, there's not a definition, I think, that they ever propose that kind of lists what are these pedagogical concepts and approaches and techniques that allow students to be placed at the center of an educational process. Um, so it's kind of hard to define in a lot of ways. I don't want to go so far as it's a you know it when you see it kind of thing. But maybe that's kind of where we're going. So to talk about student-centered learning in kind of big strokes, really what we're talking about is learning that and approaches that center student responsibilities and student activity rather than instructor control and delivery of content. And we're doing that in a few ways, right? We're thinking about reframing the balance of power and the role of the teacher in the classroom, where the student is a more active participant in knowledge creation, right? It's not the teacher is handing down knowledge from, you know, that is created outside of the classroom. The student is kind of a participant in that. And the teacher is taking on more of a facilitator role than kind of deliverer of this knowledge. Um, it's also reframing the responsibility for learning. So we have a focus on student autonomy and independence um, rather than the teacher kind of being the person who has responsibility for learning happening. The student is taking on that responsibility, and the student is owning, right? So student ownership of their educational experiences is a big element of this. And then it's also reframing the purpose of assessment and the function of content. So, thinking about assessment and content, working towards building skills for continued learning, as well as content area knowledge. So, we're not totally saying that like the content isn't important at all, but it's thinking more about helping students build skills for what happens when they encounter new material, right? Um, so that's the general vibes definition, I would say. So let's talk about some kind of specifics as well. So if we're thinking about specific strategies, or maybe, well, maybe not entirely specific strategies, we'll get into some more specific example in a minute. But if we're thinking about strategies and how this can play out in the classroom, there's a lot of things that probably a lot of people here are already doing, right? Um, Students teaching content to other students is one of the kind of ways that we're centering student experiences, right? Students evaluating their own learning or otherwise participating in the assessment of their own learning, right? Whenever students are setting their own goals, either for the whole course, right? Maybe they're part of turning out what those learning objectives are for the whole course, or maybe they're kind of goal setting for a particular small project, something like that. Students working through content at their own pace can be one of the ways, a strategy that kind of fits within this. And then lots of different kinds of student choice elements. So students choosing a particular course or project content, right? Or students choosing assessments or choosing grading criteria. Some of the things I have students do in non-language classes is like, when we're writing a paper, we develop the rubric together. So those kinds of things. And many, many more things, right? There's lots of things if we think about these definitions, right? Ways to include students as participants in knowledge creation. ways to make students kind of more responsible for their own learning, ways to show students how we're building skills rather than just content area knowledge, right? There's lots and lots and lots of things that probably a lot of us are already doing, um, that fit into these categories, right? Um, but a lot of this can be particularly challenging in first year language courses, where course content is often rigid and students are not always there by choice. Now, usually students have gotten some sort of choice of getting to pick which language, but they don't always want to necessarily be there studying a language. But also there's situations in which students haven't really got to pick their language. It was the one that still had seats open, right? There was still space in Latin or ancient Greek, or they're classics majors and like really into classical archaeology, and have to take a language, so they're kind of forced to be here. So the student choice angle is can sometimes be challenging, right? Um, and also course content often being pretty rigid. I think there's a lot of ways to see really easily how, in kind of a more communicative approach to ancient languages, a lot of these things can naturally filter in. But when you're kind of handed a textbook, right? As a lot of us are, in teaching first year language, um, and you have to kind of teach to the book, right? Seeing exactly how to make these strategies work, can be kind of challenging to see how to do. Um, that said, uh, even though the challenges are there, I think that they can help us counter some of those challenges we talked about in the beginning. The challenges of students being overburdened, the challenges of administrators being hostile to that slow process of language learning, and the kind of student motivation issues we're having around using digital tools, um, to some degree. And I think this is the approach that's worked best for me so far. So, um, how can these things help us, even though they may be hard to fit into um, first year language classes? So I have a lot of reasons why I think that they can be helpful, but I'll try to narrow it in. So as that definition kind of gave us, right, the whole point of this is to promote deeper engagement with the course material. And that kind of deep level learning, hold on, I did take notes on what I wanted to say. Um, Empirical research kind of shows us, and I have some notes, by the way, I assume you shared the slides, right, Amy?
Yes, the
Okay,
slides have been shared a couple times. Every time a new person comes in, I resend them out. So yes,
excellent. So
everyone has the slides.
if you look in the slide notes for this, I have some particular citations of research in here. So I promise I'm not just like I am not GPT just making up citations to studies that don't exist. But research indicates that students who use deep approaches are promoting deeper kind of approaches that promote deeper engagement with course material. They tend to not only earn higher grades, right, but also retain and integrate and transfer knowledge at higher rates, right? Um, they tend to enjoy their learning more. They are reflecting more on their own learning. Um, and particularly, one of the things that I found really interesting about this is that that deeper level of engagement tends to play a really important role in persistence, um, and kind of effectiveness of learning, right? So, which especially those of us who are struggling to kind of get students from our intro and beginning level courses to continue, right? That seems to me to be something that is particularly worth cultivating. It can also help us increase student self-regulation and internal motivation. Self-regulation there also shows that self-regulated learners are going to be more effective in terms of, hold on, what was the actual? I'm going to just use the quotation I pulled here. These quotations, by the way, and a lot of this survey of scholarship is coming from that Routledge handbook, which I think was particularly useful. I always love it when somebody else does the lit review for me. It's nice. Self-regulated learners are particularly effective in terms of persistence, resourcefulness, confidence, and level of academic achievement, right? So if we're helping students develop those self-regulatory strategies, right, the student-centered approaches are really geared towards that. As well as internal motivation, which I really think has got to be the key at pushing back against uh, overuse of digital tools, right? We have to convince students that doing their homework actually themselves has a point, right? That doing this practice is actually going to be useful and is going to teach them skills that are important for lifelong learning, right? And then also being able to better understand why our students choose to take our classes, right? And what they want to get out of them, which I think is a good in and of itself, but also in turn allows us to better appeal to potential students and therefore increase those enrollment sizes, and also prepare to better engage with hostile admin who want to know why they shouldn't just be able to cancel our ancient Greek class because it's under enrolled, right? We need to be able to articulate what it is that students are really getting out of this class, not just from our perspective as teachers, but from their perspectives as students. So those are kind of some of the ways that I think that this can help us think about the particular challenges that we're having with first year language classes in general. Um, and now I want to talk through some examples because that was a lot of kind of big picture stuff. Um, so I think Amy and I are just going to bring up some things that we do in class, because I think when we're thinking about student-centered strategies, like I said, a lot of this is kind of big picture in a way, right? And can be incorporated in a lot of ways, right? We could totally overhaul our classes to adopt this approach, but maybe that's not always possible, especially for those of us who are kind of handed a textbook, or for folks who are um, teaching language for the first time, or folks who are in a whole variety of different contexts, right, where we can't totally overhaul things. There's also kind of little ways that we can get these things into our classroom. So we've got some kind of big picture rethinking, lots of things, but we also have some like little focused things that can encourage student-centered approaches in kind of bite-sized ways. So let's start with the bite-sized one. So one of the things that I think Amy and I both do is these kind of student presentations. I like to refer to them as the "Why are you here?" presentation, right? So students choose a topic of interest based on their reasons for taking the course. Why do you want to learn Latin and Greek? Why are you here? Research it and then give a presentation to the class. This has been really effective for me because I don't know why they decided to be here. Um, I would like to, uh, you know, be able to suit all of the reasons why students sign up for my Latin classes. I would like to be able to incorporate them into the class, but that's not always fully possible for me. Um, and well, to be frank, all of the students who, especially at Pitt, sign up for Latin thinking that it's going to help them in med school. I don't really have the heart to tell them that like Wheelock is not built for that. So like slow down a little bit, you guys. So one of the things that I really like to do this for, right, is so students who are interested in medical vocabulary, right? They can give a present, they can research it, they can come up with some things that they think are particularly useful. They can give a presentation on it to the class. Um, and one of the things that it helps with, right, as with all of these, I think they really help students develop autonomy, right? They're taking charge of their own learning, if only over a small chunk of their own learning. It's allowing them and giving them practice in setting and achieving independent goals, right? This is not something that I assign to them, but something they're choosing. Um, and it doesn't require me to retool the whole class to suit the goals of each individual student, which is not possible most of the time, right? So it's something that we it means we can get at those individual student goals, right? We're giving students practice developing those kinds of things, but we're not actually um, getting, let's see, but it's not something I'm kind of like knowledge that I'm handing to them, right? Instead, it's something that they're generating themselves, which is not just a way out of me doing work. There's other there are other motivating factors that it can have in here, as we talked about, right? Reorienting where the knowledge production comes from, right? Um, Amy, and I think you and I both do a kind of this crowdsourced review, but do you want to talk a little bit about what yours looks like?
Yeah, absolutely. And I did want to jump in. My like, why are you here presentation? I frame a little bit differently. I mean, it does all of the same things. Um, it usually, and I'm thinking about moving it up more in the class just because Ellen talking about like getting more insight into why students are there. I have them do sort of a survey before class and I have like kind of an idea why they're there. And I usually frame it more as this is a chance to like bring some of your own interest and your own passions into class. And so I have, the framing is a tiny bit different for how but it comes to be basically the same thing, right? Some students talk about origins of medicine with the Hippocratic. Some students talk about, I had a student who, I give them a lot of free rein on this. And I had a student who really wanted to talk about a particular modern Olympics marathon. And I was like, okay, like fair. This is something that is important and you are very passionate and enthusiastic about. Fine. But I do need you to anchor it in ancient, like what is the ancient, did ancient Greeks actually run the marathon as a regular thing? Like I need you to anchor it in something. But I give them quite a lot of leeway, in large part because I'm pitching it as like this is a chance to bring your own like passions and interests and self outside of this class. Which is, I mean, again, it does a lot of the same things, but it's just a slightly different framing. Crowdsourced review, I started doing this for my second semester language classes, in part because they need a lot of review. They've forgotten things over winter break. Um, but also, and I don't have to do all of the review myself, but also because giving students, I give them a list of topics that I think we need to review, and each of them picks a topic, and it is up to them to figure out how they want to review that with their classmates. And so all of the stuff that Ellen has mentioned on this slide here, right, allows them to evaluate their own understanding. If you are talking about genitives absolute, like you better figure out if you understand them before you can teach them. Um, and I think partly, we all know that like teaching something is one of the best ways to learn it better. And so I think it's both really good for the students who are learning from their fellow student because it is being presented in a way that a student has just made sense of it for themselves. And as much as I like to think that I remember how, try to keep fresh in my mind how hard it was to first learn Greek and Latin. And I'm not a naturally gifted language learner. Like I had to work. My grades went down substantially when I moved from being an engineer to being a classics major. But like we don't really remember the first time like we didn't understand what a case was. Like we just it's for most of us it's been a minute since that was our struggles that we were learning. And so I think sometimes a student can explain it in a way that clicks better for the other students because they are closer to that experience. Um, but also like I have a student who was assigned conditionals and he taught conditionals and helped the students and like it was framed a little differently than I frame it. And I was like, oh, that's like we'll see if that clicks because sometimes just different ways of putting something will click differently for different students. But this was 2 years ago. He is still absolutely nails on conditionals. There's never been a conditional or a temporal clause, that this for Greek where they're mapped really closely onto each other, that he does not know immediately what it is. Like he has become like that is his subject and he owns that subject and that has been his subject for multiple years. And I love both the idea that like, takes some of the review off of my plate, does all these other things, but also that kind of autonomy. Like this is his thing. And anytime something comes up in class, like we know we can turn to him and be like, "Hey, what what kind of conditional are we talking about here?" And he's on it. And so I think there's it's been cool to see that as a side effect. Like I assumed that would help them learn, but I didn't understand that some of the students would take such ownership of this topic. And that has just been a really cool thing to see as a side effect of doing this.
Yeah, I love that idea of building student confidence, right? Oh, and ownership, I think is really, I really love that. And that's something I think we've talked about before too, Amy, is like sometimes you do this and then you always have somebody to point to later to be like, okay, so what kind of ablative is this? Like, do you know? Do I know? Who knows? What are we doing here? So it means that we can students are building, like they're part of that knowledge production, right? And they're building up their own expert knowledge, right? And they get to feel like real experts, which
Yeah,
is part of the goal.
like that's yeah, I think that both that confidence and agency is such a good intangible thing. Especially a lot of students are in our classes. Like I'll be honest, I advertise Greek and Latin as if you have traditionally been pretty bad at language learning, this might be a good one for you because if you know I don't pronounce like I have a hard time with R's in foreign languages and my accent is just bad. I can't roll my R's. And that was I got made fun of in my first day of Italian 101 for not being able to by the instructor to be clear, for not being able to roll my R's. And like absolutely gutted my conf. I'm like, great, I don't this is not the class for me. I'm gonna be struggling here. And so I pitch this as like if there are things about language instruction that have been hard for you, this might be a class. We use grammar translation method at in my department, and you can solve it kind of like an equation. And I know there's reasons language pedagogy, we don't want to necessarily have students thinking of decoding a sentence. We want them to learn how to read it in an actual natural processing way. But like a idea of you can look at this and you can figure out like this does this. Like I said, like when I switched from engine, it was great. I'm solving equations. Love it. And that was my road into thinking I could do languages and like pursuing a very linguistics heavy course of study afterwards. But I wouldn't have been able to do that if I didn't find a language that I was like, oh man, like I can solve this. I can do this. And so I think that confidence is such a big thing, especially if we have students in our class who are there because they have told themselves they're like not a language person. Um, I'm sorry, I don't mean to take more time than we're supposed to, Ellen. I'm sorry. But on the crowdsourced review, I was just sort of reminded of another version of this that I do in my intermediate classes. I know we were talking about like beginning language instruction, but I do want to throw out a very quick in intermediate classes, we usually teach them. I teach intermediate Greek as an independent study. Usually, we just don't have the numbers to offer it as like a proper class, which means I have just a few students, 3-ish usually. Um, and I've started having them do making review worksheets geared towards beginning students, which is great for a couple of reasons. One of which, like, I have some really great worksheets that I can use in my beginning class. But it also, like divvied up, like here's the list of all the case uses that our book says that we have for the genitive. You do half, put together some materials to help students review these. And that also, I mean, it just a version of that continues on, but especially for students who think they might be interested in teaching in some capacity, like we review, I want to make sure they're actually good worksheets that I can use with my classes. And so we do a lot of like revision feedback. Other students do peer review on what about the worksheet didn't work for them. And I think that has been something that's really been a effective and also makes my life easier kind of assignment.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I love and that idea of kind of crowdsourced review in multiple levels in different ways. Yeah, I think really works. So those are kind of smaller, bite-sized things that are kind of able to be incorporated into any class. In terms of bigger picture stuff, I think some of the stuff that Amy and I have done, I've spent a lot of time over the past few years rethinking engagement in my class generally. So one of the ways that I've done this, and I've tried out multiple strategies, and here's the one that I've landed on. Um, uh, is I have students evaluate their own engagement, specifically by submitting weekly reports. They're doing field reports, so I call them commentary. We're doing some Latin in there. So students are choosing from kind of a menu of in-class or homework tasks that they complete each week, and then reflect on their time spent in language learning when they submit this report. So in a lot of ways, it's almost like they're doing a time card for me, right? They're telling me, or really, I say they're telling me, but really the point here is that they're developing their metacognitive skills, right? They're thinking, what did I do this week? What was actually useful and what wasn't that useful, right? Did I show up to class, but I hadn't done the homework? So showing up to class wasn't maybe the most effective use of, of my time, right? Or did I spend a lot of time taking notes this week in this particular way, and that really worked for me? So helping students develop autonomy, but also and developing those metacognitive skills of like what actually worked in terms of my learning this week. Um, allowing students to kind of to set and achieve independent goals, right? They're coming up with their own goals for the week. Basically, they're setting their goals for the week, as well as setting goals over the course of the semester. Um, and then it's also allowing them to evaluate their learning and their time spent, right? So they're evaluating their own engagement in the course. And for me, that is going to determine a grade, right? This is what determines their engagement grade. So there's a lot on their plate, and they can really it makes it easy to visualize, right? They can see uh how the effort they're putting in is corresponding to their learning in a given week, right? And that for me is a real goal, right? So much of language learning is about the time you put into it, right? um uh and a lot of it can be about the effectiveness of that time, right? What particular task did you do? But a lot of it just really depends on how much time did you spend thinking about this week. So um, a lot of what I end up having students do to think about that is kind of had a big picture impact on changing how I assess students in my class in terms of engagement and homework and attendance and all of that kind of stuff. I did share, by the way, this part of the syllabus for my class is shared in the notes. I can share more too later if folks have follow-up questions you want to ask about how we do this. But that's kind of my big picture thing that I've been thinking about a lot over the past few years. And Amy has been spending a lot of time rethinking testing. Do you want to talk about that?
I would love to. And I threw the links just directly to the engagement assignments in the chat as well here. I have one that I use less so for my language classes, but it's one that I use in my other classes that I stole from commentary and remodified it for a lot of my like literature kind of classes. So I added that there as well, but it's not as directly geared towards language classes. Tests. So for Greek, my Greek classes, and I haven't taught Latin in a hot minute, so these are all these are all Greek specific thing. But I mean, this is applicable across the languages. I don't. Some students think this is cute. Some just kind of roll their eyes, but I do not call them tests. I call them testlets because I'm like really trying to. I tell them like I know it's kind of cheesy, but I want them to sound small and cute, and they are slightly bigger than our small quizzes. But I, really do a lot of frequent low stakes assignments in my classes. And so the quizzes are not meant to be super big and scary. The testlets are equally there. It's a slightly broader. It's not targeting one specific thing, but they are not meant to be big and scary. And some students appreciate that, and some are like, whatever. But so for their testlets, they are designed to be harder than they can probably do. And I tell them that because it is meant, like the focus on this is to figure out the places where we didn't know things as well as we could. And so your grade is, so I tend to scale them weirdly over the course of the semester, where, so like for the first one, the test itself is going to be like 10 points, and the test corrections are like 40-ish points. And it scales up. The actual original test, the first take is going to generally stay in the 10 to 20 point range. But the corrections will start to scale increasingly as the semester goes on, because when I first tried this, just how the math was working out, they weren't needing to necessarily, some of them who had done everything weren't necessarily needing to do their last corrections on some of the testlets towards the end of the semester. So I kind of scale them, and I've started being pretty transparent about this with, like, let me explain to you, just like if we're worrying about the numbers, the tests, like the corrections are the overwhelming bulk of those points. How you do on the first pass does not really matter. That is a diagnostic for you and for me. It will not impact your grade hardly at all. What will impact your grade is that process of doing the corrections. And they have a test wrapper that they do with this about, like, as I was going through my corrections, what did I learn? What did I figure out? What was I not prepared enough for? What did I, and so they do a lot of metacognition as part of that process. For their corrections, they can use the book, they can use me, they can use each other, they can use their notes, they can use whatever they want to get that cleaned up. And part of this is, and this actually gets to a question that someone had submitted privately, but this is not how our students have been taught that learning works. This is not how they have generally, by the time they get to if you are teaching at a 4-year college or university, our students are really good at studenting. That doesn't necessarily mean they're really good at learning, right? And I spend a decent amount of time in class, like just beating that drum over and over, that I know this is how you have been taught that school works before. And it's going to be hard for you to learn a new way. And like, you were really good at that. And it sucks that that's not what I'm asking you to do, because you spent a lot of time developing those skills. What I want you to do is make a bunch of mistakes in our class, because that is how learning works, right? We need to be okay making mistakes. We need to be okay learning and expressing having trouble with things. And that's just not what a student who's been, getting A's all through high school is necessarily used to doing, raising their hand and being like, I don't understand what a subjunctive is. Like I'm lost. And so in all my classes, I spend a decent amount of time trying to sort of like getting them to unlearn what they have learned about how a class works. And that takes time, and that takes buy-in from the students, and it takes there's I get to cover a little less Greek every day that I revisit why we're doing it this way. But I usually share, there was a physics professor at the time, I hated him. I had a physics professor in college who prided himself on getting just this perfect bell curve on test results for like a large lecture class. It'd be like 300 people in the class. And he prided himself on how perfect his bell curve was, and centered over, I think, 70, wherever he wanted but it was just the perfect bell curve. And he would, after every test, he would show off the grade distribution and see how close he came to a perfect bell curve. Um, and, I think a lot of that is very silly, and, I don't curve my tongue. But the thing that I really took away from that was he said that no one should be getting 100% on a test. Because if you get 100% on a test, it means that, like, did you know exactly what was covered, or did you know more and I wasn't able to measure it? And that like really lodged in my brain somehow, that if you know everything on the test, like, that's not actually a very good metric for how well you're doing with this material, because could I have made it far more challenging, or is that exactly how much you knew? And if we think about tests as being more diagnostic, right, more formative assessments than a show me how good you are, and that's how I brand you with whatever grade you are. If we think about it as this iterative process, yeah, like you shouldn't be getting it right on everything right on the first try, because maybe didn't challenge you that much. And so I spend a lot of time telling students like they don't get a number on their first pass through. I don't put any numbers on it. I just mark up all the incorrect questions, just put an X, no information on it. And the real focus is think about how to correct these, right? Go through that process, figure out what went wrong, and you're going to write me a little blurb at the end. Um, and I think it's great as Ellen notes here, right? It reduces testing and grade anxiety. There is still a ton of work that I have to do about being like, don't worry about the grade. I promise. If you do all of the things, I'm grading much more on a completion sort of scale. If your testlets or if your corrections are good enough, then you get complete, and complete in Canvas is 100%, right? It's an all or nothing kind of format. So like if you do a good enough job on all of your stuff that I accept it, you'll be fine grade wise. If it is not good enough to accept, you're going to redo it. This is for homework. This is for, right? If it's not good enough, we're going to try it again. I will say it takes more work. I have to regrade things. My Greek class is small enough I can do that. I would not be able to implement something like this in a large class. But I guess that's a silver lining of not having as many students enrolled in Greek as we might like. It gives me the flexibility to do that. But again, this like focus on growth and progress rather than perfection. But it does take a lot of all of these things, getting students to buy in. I've had students tell me that like they don't think X is their job. That's my job as the professor. Why am I asking them to do this stuff? And so I do think all of this really takes some intentional framing about why am I doing this? It's not because I don't want to do my job. Like that's not why I'm asking you to generate discussion questions or, you know, correct your own assignment against it. Like none of it is because I don't want to do my job. It is because, you know, and I bring studies out. Some students really love a good study to prove this, but like this is how learning works, right? We're thinking intentionally about this, and you will learn more. I'm sorry that you're going to hate it, but you will actually learn more if you do this. And some students buy in very quickly and find it to be like a liberating experience that their grading is not. And I mean, I also tell them right up front, like I don't like, you know, there are reasons we have grades. I think grades oftentimes are not conducive to learning.
Mm.
And like we will be using grades in this class as an incentive and a motivator to help you do the things that you need to do to learn. That is what it is there. It is to in a busy world of you have a million different things that you're being asked to do in your time with your time. I am going to give you points that go along with this assignment because I know that that is sort of the currency of the classroom, right? And I get why you wouldn't do if there's no grade associated with your Latin homework and you have a all or nothing 100% of your grade tests in your biology class. Like I get why you would blow off my class. That is why there are points assigned, not because I want to use them as a cudgel to punish you, but because I want to use them as incentives to help you do the things that we have all agreed we all want to do. We all want to learn Latin for whatever reason we want to learn Latin, and they are there to incentivize that process.
Yeah, and I think actually that's a really good transition to the next thing, which is caveats. I will say I originally titled this slide Caveat Lecturor. But I was told that that was not a funny joke, but
Okay,
I
I didn't tell you that, to be clear. That sounds like I was your partner having
caveat
opinions.
lecturer, yeah,
For the
that's not
record, for everyone here,
jokes,
I think it would have been
right?
lovely.
Should play in this audience more than any other. Anyway, but we have some caveats. Basically, that we have to balance all of this. Students' personal goals and considering students' personal goals against our own pedagogical objectives as teachers. There are going to be some complicators in here, and there's some reasons why we can't necessarily just throw everything at the students and kind of expect them to totally take charge of their own education and do all of the work themselves, right? So one of the important things to consider here is that we are in fact the experts, right? And especially in our current informational and political environment, it is really important that we teach students to recognize and value expert knowledge. One of the goals here, right, is to show them how hard it is to develop that expert knowledge, right? How much time and effort it takes. But motivate them and make them feel confident that they could do it too, right? So it's not the point of this is not to kind of bust up kind of educational hierarchies because those the expert knowledge isn't a thing worth valuing, right? Mostly it's to show students kind of that they could like there is a path to attaining that and to make clear what that path is, right? um so and because we are experts, right, sometimes we're going to be better at judging what is going to be most effective for students uh than they are, right? We have some of us have decades of not just language experience, but like learning experience um, on our students, right? So it's important that we teach them to recognize and value that, while also giving them the tools and the skills and the confidence, right? Um, to understand, right, that they can actually build some of that knowledge too, right? Um, Also, one of the things that I have completely failed at several times over the last few years, so this is my warning, is that putting too much cognitive load back on students will backfire. So one of the things, especially with that engagement assignment, that I really kind of had to hone and figure out over the past few years, um, is having a menu of homework assignments, or too much kind of choice, right? As we all know, can be destabilizing when you open an app and there's just too many restaurant options. I just am like, I'm gonna hand this to somebody else. So figuring out kind of as an experiment often with your students, figuring out what is the right amount of decision making and autonomy that you can kind of hand over to them. And that's really going to be dependent on your students, your class size, a lot of the kind of uh, what we might call kind of surface level elements of learning, right? Like how big is the class? What actually is the material? What is the textbook like? How much freedom do you have in the classroom? Um, a lot of those things are going to, um, it's going to depend. And it's also going to depend on sometimes individual students, but also in kind of a mass scale, what your students are like at your institution. Um, and then that kind of leads to the next thing, which is there is, in fact, no one best strategy. And this is empirical research says this too, right? There are a lot of things that work. And this is one of the reasons why I think actually it is kind of useful to think about student-centered approaches as kind of vibes-based. It's really important that we experiment to see what works best for us and our students. An approach, I had students who across the same class where kind of this engagement based or this choose your own adventure engagement was really really stressful, and so I had to adapt it by giving them particular strategies. So I was like, okay, come and meet with me and we'll come up with a plan for what you should try to attempt on a given week, and then we'll reassess in a few weeks, right? So there's no one kind of best strategy that works for everybody. We're all going to have to kind of experiment and see what works. And what works one year might not work the next year. What works with one student might not work well with the next student. So a lot of this really is based on experimenting and fine tuning and not being too afraid to make mistakes and kind of change course. Um, The other thing that I really recommend, especially about the experimentation, is being upfront with your students about what you're trying to achieve, right? As Amy said, talking to your students about, like, I know that you're going to push back against this. And a lot of students do push back really hard, right? They want a teacher focused model of education, right? They want lecture because they think that's the way that they learn best. They're almost always wrong. Um, but it's really hard to demonstrate that to them, right? Um, so being upfront, kind of giving your argument for why you're doing this, explaining to them and making them part of the process and the experiment is also part of the tenets of student-centered teaching, right? That's kind of what we're doing, is elucidating kind of what's going on in the learning process and teaching them how to do this thing. So being upfront with them, telling them, I haven't tried this before, but we're going to try it this time, is something I really like. And then soliciting feedback from them too when you do that kind of experiment. I will say, as Amy mentioned, like, you should expect there to be pushback. And I think one of the really hardest things is figuring out what is pushback just um, that is kind of expected, right? Um, because you're asking people to do something that's hard, and like, I also don't like being asked to do things that are hard, even when it's me myself asking myself to do a thing that is hard. Um, I swear a
Right.
lot while
Um,
exercising, right? Like, I don't like it. But it's hard. I think that the hardest balancing is being able to tell what is just pushback because you're asking them to do something hard and what is pushback because they've reached that line of what is too much of a cognitive load, right? So that is another part of this experimentation process. Yeah, Amy, sorry, go ahead.
yeah, no. I was gonna say for all my classes, like as part of if they use it like participation log or not or whatever, but they're like every week they're doing a journal entry for me about how the class is going. And oftentimes I'll give them a specific prompt about like, hey, we just had our first test lit. How you feeling? Or do you feel like how comfortable do you feel making a mistake in class? So like I have a pretty good kind of back channel communication with the students because they are required, in my language class, it's like 5% of their grade is their like weekly journals, and like they need to do them. And that's a place that I can get feedback specifically on some of that. But the other thing that I would add is I'm pretty, I don't know, aggressive is not the right word maybe, but like telling students like I'm trying something new. I will not screw you over on this. Like trust me that like this is an experiment, and if I have made mistakes in this experiment, you will not suffer. I will take care of you. You will not get a bad grade because I screwed something up. Because I didn't plan ahead right, because I didn't anticipate something. Like trust me that I'm not going to do that to you. And I reiterate this, especially every time like midterm grade comes out or whatever, of like we will, if this doesn't work, like I did a Ellen's participation thing, like you need a total of a certain number of points participation over the course of the semester for each grade. And I was like, I don't know, like this is new, and uh I'm gonna give you a lower number than I would otherwise. Like I'm trying it out. And like this is I'm not trying if I didn't estimate math appropriately based on how this is gonna go, I will not punish you guys, right? Like, and I think that hopefully helps them be a little less resistant because I'm like pretty blunt about like I understand that like there's already it's weird and I'm asking you to do things you haven't done before. Here's my reasons why, but know that if something goes wrong, you're not going to get a C because I didn't tell you about something very well.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I think that kind of upfrontness, I think, can help a lot too. Um, uh, and it also helps us too, and maybe that's part and parcel of the last thing, which is we also have to set limits that prioritize our goals and workload, right? And also we're not going to be perfect, and that's fine. I don't uh this also ties into there is no one best strategy for all of this, right? We also have to set limits, right? There are things that we can do with a class of 5 students or 10 students, our fun under-enrolled Latin and Greek courses, that we can't do with a full class of 20 students or more, right? There are things that we may have to cut back on, that we thought when we started the semester would totally work, and it turns out that actually this is not working and we need to turn around and do something else, right? Um, I will say the commentarius assignment, the way that I've been doing it, it takes a lot of time. It's a lot of kind of individual interaction with students, and it works really well um, most of the time. And then some semesters it has eaten up my time, and I kind of had to make some decisions about exactly how to give feedback in some of these to some of those to some students. So one of the things that we want to make sure we're doing is in moving the focus of learning, right, from the teacher to the student. We're not saying that the teacher is no longer important, and no longer has kind of a role or a say in their own workload. So important caveat here. Okay, so we are a little bit past 2 o'clock. I thought that would take less time than it did. Oops. I think what we'll do is take a short break for those of you who have to go. Thank you for joining us. I know that some folks have to cut out around 2. But for those who can stick around for kind of our workshopy discussion portion of the event, let's maybe come back in, let's say I said a 5-minute break, but let's say a 3-minute break.